Okay, how are you guys doing today? I do realize that chapter 5 was a little difficult. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there to help you out. As you can imagine, usually we do have a lot of lectures, which I spend a lot of time doing exercises and explaining all this stuff. It's not the easiest material, so what could we do? You know what happened, you know how things went. I did my best trying to record these lectures, but unfortunately it took too long and they only were available in the end. But I do have some good news. However, you will have to wait a little bit to hear it. For now, let's just move on to chapter 6. Chapter 6 is the last chapter we will do. We'll go through all 6 sections of it. Usually I don't go through all 6 sections of it, but in this case we will. And hopefully that will be a satisfying experience for you. Anyway, what is chapter 6 about? Chapter 6 is about propositions. Anyway, chapter 6 is about propositional logic. What is propositional logic? Well, before we used to deal with the terms, and now we'll be dealing with propositions. There's a big difference between terms and propositions. This is an example of a simple proposition which we'll be talking about, which we'll take as an example. Fast foods tend to be unhealthy. Something like this. Remember that this is a statement, right? It is a simple statement or simple proposition which we can just represent with the letter F, and it will have a particular truth value, right? Because it's either true or false. So fast foods tend to be unhealthy. Is it true or is it false? Well, it's probably true, right? So we can just write F when we say F is true, and F will mean for us fast foods tend to be unhealthy. Now today we will also talk about slightly more complex entities, which are compound statements. Compound statements which you have in a book are: it is not the case that Al-Qaeda is a humanitarian organization, Diane Reeves sings jazz and Christina Aguilera sings pop, either people get serious about conservation or energy prices will skyrocket, if nations spurn international law then future wars are guaranteed, and finally the Broncos will win if and only if they run the ball. Okay, so the first one, it is not the case that Al-Qaeda is a humanitarian organization. Why is it compound? Well, it actually has one statement. However, this statement is what is known in logic as negated. The statement itself is Al-Qaeda is a humanitarian organization. We can put an A instead of it, right? However, we are told that it is not the case. It is not the case that Al-Qaeda is a humanitarian organization. So how do we represent the fact that it is negated using logical operators? We can just say not A, tilde. That is what we are using to basically deny the proposition, to say it is not true, it is not the case. Now, next situation, Diana Ring sings jazz and Christina Aguilera sings pop. Note that here we have two distinct propositions. Each one of them can be true or false. Diana Reeves sings jazz, that could, for example, be false. Christina Aguilera sings pop, that could be true. So this is a very good example of a compound statement, and we can represent both of them as Diana Reeves sings jazz is a D, Christina Aguilera sings pop would be C, just the first letters. Now how do we connect them? It says and, Diana Reeves sings jazz and Christina Aguilera sings pop. In logic we use a dot to represent and, D and C. Next, either people get serious about conservation or energy prices will skyrocket. We have either or situation. When we have either or situation, again, we can use a particular logical operator to represent it. So people will get serious about conservation would be P. Energy prices will skyrocket would be E. And how do we show it is either P or E? We use it a wedge, what is known as wedge. Pay attention that it's actually not a V. It is written as kind of a half size of the letter, a bit smaller than V, so that we could see that this is a wedge between them. Next one, if nations spurn international law, then future wars are guaranteed. Now you probably remember this is our good old friend hypothetical statement, right? How do we represent a hypothetical statement? We actually do have a good way to do so. Now we have antecedent and we have a consequent here. Remember, so what would be the antecedent? Nations spurn international law. That would be our antecedent, and we can just write N. Future wars are guaranteed. That would be our consequent, and we can represent it as F. And how do we connect them? How do we say if nations spurn international law, then future wars are guaranteed? Well, there's actually two ways to do it. The book uses horseshoe, which is a fair enough of a way. Some other logic books use error, and you will notice that on a PowerPoint sometimes I use error. Well, I actually prefer error, and I also thought that you should know that this is another way to show it. The important thing here is to show the direction. We are going from N to F. So you can either use horseshoe or you can use an error, whichever way you prefer. Keep in mind both of them mean the same thing. They mean if N, then F. And finally, the Broncos will win if and only if they run the ball. So in this case we have yet another different relation, if and only if. So the Broncos will win will be B. Running the ball would be, well, let's say R. Run the ball. Now how do we connect it? How do we say they will win if and only if they run the ball? Well, it's a triple bar. And this is all the logical connectors we need. That is actually the complete list of them. Tilde, dot, wedge, horseshoe, and the triple bar. They are well enough explained in a book. Few other things about them. We call this a negation. So anytime we use tilde, and we pronounce it usually not, we call it negation. This would be a conjunctive statement. This would be a disjunctive statement. This would be what is known as a conditional statement. And finally, this is known as biconditional statement. We also call this conjunction, disjunction, implication, and equivalency. That's another way to call these particular relations. Okay, now let's look at what are the important things we have there. We do have different examples of how you can use all of them. I would have gone through them in class in more detail. Right now I'm not going to, because it will take too much time. The main operator. What is a main operator? Well, there is a very simple rule to figure out. You can have a fairly long, complex statement. Something such as this, for example. So note that in this case we are saying it's not the case that A or B and not C and A. What would be the main operator here? Well, the simple rule to figure out what your main operator is, just look at whatever is outside all the brackets and parentheses. And then anything there will beat the tilde. It will be whatever other than the tilde. You cannot have more than 2 operators outside of all the brackets and parentheses, tilde and something else. It will always be either just one of them, in which case it is clear that this is the main operator, or tilde and something else, in which case anything will beat the tilde. So in this case we have actually 2 of them outside of parentheses. We have a dot and a tilde. So what's the main operator? The dot, because anything beats the tilde. Tilde will only be a main operator if that's the only one. If it is the only one outside all the brackets and parentheses, then tilde will be a main operator. So for example, if this was the case, then tilde would be your main operator, because outside the parentheses you only have tilde, nothing else. Okay, so main operator is usually not a very difficult concept to grasp. Now, few other things. We do usually say for conjunction and, D and C, but in language there are different other ways to represent it. So but and however. Okay, so the usual ways for logical operators to be pronounced when you say something, not A and instead of a dot, D and C, or P or E, if then, so if and then F, and finally if and only if B, if and only if R. But in language, again, there are a few other situations when you can pronounce them slightly differently. So for example, instead of and, in some situations you can also see a situation when it would say but. So blah blah blah, but blah blah blah. That would also be translated as a dot. And however. Veg, which is usually translated or. Sometimes you can see a situation when it says either P or E instead of just or E, P or E. Sometimes you can also see the word unless. Unless would also be translated as P or E. P unless E. Something like that in language. Also remember that these two are logically equivalent. What does it mean? That means that if you change them places D and C, C and D, P and E, E and P, the value does not change. So you can do it for these two. You cannot do it for this one, because if you change N and F, if you switch them around, that's no longer going to be the same thing. You will change the true value of the whole thing, and so that is not allowed. A very important thing about implication. This is something which students usually have a little bit of a trouble with. So when in language it says if then, if and then F, that is translated N F. Now, there could be 2 other situations with the word if, and you have to understand the difference between them. So one of them you can say blah 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 if blah blah blah, and another one you can say blah 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 only if blah blah blah. This is what you would say in language, but you translate them differently. So for example, if you say and if F, the way you would translate it is not if and then F, but the other way around. You have to actually switch them. You switch them around. But if it says and only if F, then you actually don't switch them. You say and F. So remember, if you switch them around. Only if you don't. This is perhaps the most important part about all these translations. Now let's look at this exercise. This is exercise 1, and usually I do have students do it in class themselves. However, in this case, we can do it together. So it asks you to translate the following statements into symbolic form using uppercase letters to represent affirmative English statements. And it gives you an example how to do it. So the first one there is Arizona has a national park, but Nebraska does not. Note that you are given letters A and N. What do they stand for? Arizona has a national park, but Nebraska does not. Students very often make mistake here because they are correctly identifying but as a dot. However, they are making a mistake when they are translating it as A or N, when in fact, note that it says Nebraska does not. So you have two statements here. A is Arizona has a national park, and N is Nebraska has a national park. So the statement is A and not N because it says Nebraska does not. This is important. Now the other two are the straightforward. Either Stanford or Tulane has an architecture school. That of course would be S or T. Okay, and now our good old friend sufficient and necessary condition. So if we have a conditional statement such as if C then L, remember this is our antecedent and it is a sufficient condition for L. And this is our consequent and it is a necessary condition for C. Now you have another good way to remember it, in case if you did not remember it up until this moment. So since this is sufficient condition and this is necessary condition, you can just twist the horseshoe a little bit into U and it becomes sun. So this is how you can remember what is sufficient, what is necessary. S-U-N, sun. Sufficient condition, horseshoe, necessary condition. So antecedent is always sufficient condition, consequent is always necessary condition, and the horseshoe is just kind of sideways. Equivalency would be something like this. The example in a book. JFK tightens security if and only if O'Hare does. So J triple bar O. JFK tightens security, O'Hare tightens security. JFK only does that if O'Hare does. If and only if. How do you translate? This is actually two implications. It goes two ways. So what it essentially means is J, if J then O, and if O then J. So it goes both ways. They are both sufficient and necessary condition for each other. So it is much stronger connection than here. Now all this stuff will kind of become important next time. For now, we will just do the exercises and hopefully you guys will understand it well enough with the exercises and then do the homework well enough. So what is the good news I told you about at the beginning? The good news is actually there will be no test for chapter 5. Instead of the test for chapter 5, we will have only one test for chapter 6, and that will be a final. That will be 25% of the grade, which of course is very important. So make sure you do chapter 6 very well. With the 5, we're already done. The only thing for 5 is the homework, and once you've done with the homework, you've done with chapter 5. Okay, let's look at a couple more examples just so that you guys could see how to do the homework and so on. So let's look at exercise 2. Chanel has a rose with fragrance if Lanvin does. How do you translate that? Okay, so we have two statements here, right? Chanel has a rosewood fragrance if Lanvin does. So let's say this is C and L. Very often students just make a mistake right away because they put a horseshoe between them and say if C then L. But remember, it says Chanel has rosewood fragrance if Lanvin does. It has blah 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 if blah blah blah. So you have to actually switch them around. This is where you get tripped off. It actually, the correct answer is L, if L then C, rather than the other way around. So pay attention to that. One more thing with, so Reese Witherspoon wins Best Actress only if Martin Scorsese wins Best Director. Right? So this is R and M. How do you connect them? Well, it is blah 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 only if blah blah blah. So in that case you actually don't switch them around. In that case it just looks the same way. Last one. Either Mariah Carey sings pop and Elton John sings rock, or Diana Krall sings jazz. Well, you do have the letters, right? The letters would be M, E, and D. So either Mariah Carey sings pop and Elton John sings rock, of course you would put a dot here, or Diana Krall sings jazz, you would put a verge here. But where to put the parentheses? Well, you put them where the words either and or are, because the words either and or kind of put a particular chunk of it together. Either Mariah Carey sings pop and Elton John sings rock, or. So that is where the parentheses will go. Okay, so hopefully this is not too long for you, and I seem to be a little bit confused today. I guess maybe I'm a little tired or something. Anyway, but keep on doing the exercises and hopefully it'll still be helpful, and we will move on to next lecture next time. Thank you very much and have a good day.